Hey guys, so to wrap up my coverage of Big Brother Canada 11, I'm going to be doing a player ranking all 16 players based on the games that they played during the season. And this was a bit of a wonky list given what happened, but we'll get to that in a moment. But there are 16 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 16, we have someone who is here pretty much by default, but here we have Amal, and I do feel bad putting Amal at the bottom here where we really didn't really see anything from her game. There isn't really anything you can say, either positive or negative, about her game, given she left so early and we didn't really even see her on the digital dailies or on the show. So it's impossible to really gauge just how well or poorly she was playing in that very brief period of time. But at the end of the day, that is her game. I feel like we had the least evidence we can really say for Amal. And I do feel bad that she left so early. And if we are to suspect how she would have done based on what happened later on, I think she could have been a number for Koozie in the Crown, as I suspect that she would have gone along with those people. But at the end of the day, we just don't know because, again, there's just so little gain to assess from her. So I feel like because of that, I kind of had to put her at the bottom by default. So because of that, she is here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have someone that we can obviously say a bit more about, and it's actually not the first boot, but still someone that played relatively poorly. But here we have Vanessa. And the reason I have Vanessa this low is I feel like Vanessa was never really in an alliance at any point. I feel like despite her being a potential number for the Koozie side, that she never really was a part of that. She was just someone that was kind of on the outs. And even so, she was seen as a bit of an influence in the game, albeit not a super positive one. She obviously gets into that fight with Zach during week 2. That's not the greatest look. And then week 3, while she is put up as a pawn, there was a lot of danger for her to be targeted, as there were people that would have been willing to vote her out, even as a pawn on the block. So I feel like that kind of shows that she's just not someone that was well insulated in the game. And obviously, she leaves the game after that point. So because of that, like she doesn't have much to go off of here. But really, I feel like Vanessa is someone that doesn't really have many pros to her game. And I feel like she was someone that was on the bottom for a lot of it. And you can even say like there were points where she was playing pretty poorly. So I feel like because of that, I do have her here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and I actually had this person one spot higher before I started recording. However, after thinking about it more and more, they really did play a pretty bad game. But we actually have Dan Zabo, the first juror on the board. And it's weird to put Dan this low considering he did technically make the jury, albeit a lot of that was because of like people like walking that resulted in the jury phase starting a bit earlier than it probably would have otherwise. But really, I feel like Dan, in many ways, is similar to Vanessa, where there was never a point where he was really in an alliance at some point. And you could even make the argument that he played more actively bad than someone like a Vanessa, where early on, like he was obviously on the outs there. He was put up on the block in that spot. Mind you, he wasn't going home in that spot. And I did consider that as a factor over putting him like above like JM, but we'll get to that in a moment. But really, he is someone that's on the bottom and someone that would have been targeted the very next week by Zach and Ty until Dan wins HOH. And you would think this would be a point where Dan would properly start to play the game more actively, maybe start to build more inroads, but really he doesn't. Instead, like he pretty much just follows Zach and Ty, pretty much lets them dictate his HOH to where he puts up Hope and Renee, with obviously Rob as a target, and really that doesn't really benefit his game at all, and really doesn't benefit Zach and Ty's game either, but we'll get into that more later. But even beyond like him doing his bidding, he's not even building like any inroads with those people. Like he is still going to be targeted by them not too long afterwards. But then the very next week, like he's just sort of there for a lot of it. Technically loses the people that he was a bit more open to working with. And then you have his boot week where Santina is the HOH, like someone that in theory should be a bit more open to working with him. But instead, like she's just fine letting him go. And he's obviously voted out unanimously. So I feel like on the whole, Dan's game is pretty mediocre, where he largely is on the outs. He never really is able to build an alliance with anyone. Really, the only thing that he has at any point is kind of a showmance with Shenaya, but even then, that's not too much, as I feel like Shenaya wasn't going to do that much to save him at the end of the day. And I feel like even beyond that, he was literally letting the people that were willing to target him control his HOH in a spot where they still were not planning to work with him moving forward. So I feel like because of that, like I can't really praise much with Dan, despite the fact that he is technically making it farther than people will be talking about soon. So I feel like because of that, there's just so much bad with Dan's game. He is here, number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we do have the formal first boot of the season, but here we have John Michael. And I do feel bad for John Michael. He was one of the bigger fans coming into the season, and really someone that never really found his footing either. And I did debate between like him and these other players. However, I feel like John didn't do as much wrong to be the first target. Where, yeah, you can fault him for telling Zach and Ty that he wanted to target like the big guys, but he did that in a spot where he thought he wanted to work with Zach moving forward, and he did want to work with Zach moving forward. But then Zach takes that and uses it to lead the charge against JM, resulting in JM being backdoored, despite that not even being in Zach's best interest. So I feel like that's pretty bad, the fact that Zach was wanting to target John, despite the fact that John was pretty open to wanting to work with him moving forward. But even though he is booted earlier than Vanessa or Dan, there are two main reasons why I have him above them. One is that he was backdoored, unlike Vanessa, who was put up on the block immediately, albeit as a pawn, and Dan, who was obviously put up immediately and stayed on the block. The fact that JM was backdoored is at least something to consider for me. But I think the bigger factor is that even though he was voted out unanimously, there were plenty of people that wanted to keep him around. There were three factions in the game that would have been interested in keeping JM. You have the Ty, Claudia, Jonathan side, you have the Daniel and Anika side, and you have Koozie. All of them wanted to keep JM in the game, and had they come together, they could have led a resistance to save JM. But obviously, none of them felt confident enough to go through with it. None of them really put the pieces together to keep JM in the game. And I feel like, yes, you can fault JM for not really campaigning harder to get those sides to come together, but the fact that those sides were there was enough to make me have JM a bit higher. The fact that there was a chance that he could have stayed. And even after he leaves, there are people that say that they regret voting out JM. So I feel like there was that potential there, as JM technically was not a consensus target, even though the vote counts as otherwise. But at the end of the day, I feel like JM still like isn't the greatest player in the world. He still did get targeted by someone that he wanted to work with. And at the end of the day, he didn't really put the pieces together to keep himself safe, which is why he is here number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone that is sort of in line with the players we already talked about, but here we have Santina. And Santina is a player that I did debate putting a little bit higher, as at the end of the day, I don't think her game is the worst in the world, but I feel like she is closer to that of players we just talked about, where despite her having a bit of longevity, she isn't exactly in the core power structure for too long in the game. Where early on, she does win the first HOH, which you do have to credit her, as the first HOH should be a position that is beneficial as it allows you to set the power structure. However, I feel like she doesn't play it that well, as she pretty much just allows Zach and Ty to control her HOH in a spot where, again, Zach and Ty are not that close to her. Mind you, I think they were more willing to work with Santina than Dan moving forward, but I still feel like Santina doesn't do herself many favors. She doesn't really build much relationships outside of Zach and Ty, to where a lot of those players start to see her as an extension of them, which isn't great. And again, she targets John Michael in a spot that doesn't particularly benefit her. And then moving forward, she is kind of on an island. I mean, she's not really included in the alliance, despite the fact that she was, again, the first HOH. During week 3, Koozie does put her up on the block, and there was actually a chance that she could have been targeted if Zach was not ultimately on the block already. However, obviously Zach goes there, and I feel like that doesn't benefit her too much. She does win HOH again, however, she decides to target Dan Zabo, again, one of the outsiders, and I feel like that also doesn't benefit her game. And then moving forward, she is, again, like not really in the core majority group. However, then we get to the Ty HOH, which I think is a bit of a step up for her game, where for one, she is technically the swing vote during the round where Hope goes home. She is the swing vote between Hope and Jonathan. And she was even in a spot to where, had Hope gone, she could have been a new member of the Crown Alliance. So it did seem like she was trying to get a bit of footing in the game. But then the Fatal Feast happened, and I feel like that just allowed her to go home there. I feel like she was pretty primed to go home in something like that, given that she didn't really have many allies in the future. Now, granted, Koozie put her on the block already, so like take that as you will. But at the end of the day, I feel like Santina is someone that was rarely in the majority group, and I feel like she is someone that may struggle to win a jury vote in a lot of scenarios. Now, I think had she won a bunch of comps and got away towards the end, I think she could have built up this underdog story. But really, she is someone that didn't have too many allies throughout the game. And while she was starting to pick up a bit during her last week, I feel like it wasn't enough to save her, as well, they didn't save her during the Fatal Feast. So obviously that's a knock there. And really, I feel like Santina's game is pretty mediocre outside of that. So because of that, she is here number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we probably have the toughest player on the board to assess here. And I did debate these next two, as I feel like this player is probably a departure from these players we already talked about. And you could make the debate that the person I have above them is more in line with certain players we already talked about. However, I feel like this person has a massive mix of pros and cons that causes him to just sort of slide here. But at number 11, I did decide to go with Zach. And Zach, again, is very hard to assess. Now, a lot of people say pretty bad things about Zach, and believe me, there are plenty of holes in Zach's game. However, Zach does technically control the first 2 weeks of the game. He is influencing the HOH weeks of Santina and Dan Zabo, which is pretty impressive on its own. However, obviously the biggest fault here is the things he does with that control. Where during week 1, he wants to target John Michael, even though John Michael wants to work with him moving forward, which is pretty not ideal, as it obviously takes away someone that wants to work with him moving forward. And then in week 2, he wants to target Rob, someone that was still pretty loyal to Zach, and causes him to completely blow up the Guys Alliance that he had built during those first 2 weeks, and really a Guys Alliance that probably should have controlled the early sections of the game. But that just allows Ty to go after Rob and completely blow that up to where by week 3, both him and Ty are pretty big targets in the game. Now, Koozie does decide to go after him. Now, I do question whether it was the correct move for Koozie to target Zach at that point. But it's also pretty clear that Koozie was just fed up with Zach, with his arrogance, with his cockiness, and decides to backdoor him. And obviously at that point, Zach tries to save himself. He campaigns pretty hard. He tries to get Hope DQ'd for sneaking the letter in. And obviously that all results in him quitting the game. So it's obviously not good at all. He pretty much does a lot of his downfall to himself. However, even beyond that, there was technically people that wanted to save him during that week, and had he not quit, there actually could have been a shot that he could have stayed over Santina, which is pretty impressive there. However, at the same time, I feel like he is so out in front to where even if he had survived that week, I can't really see how it gets too much further into the game. I feel like he had made himself such a massive target to where it was only a matter of time before he was going to lose control. And at the first moment that he loses control, he pretty much just gives up. So that's not particularly great. And even beyond that, he does so much of his downfall to himself. So it was too hard for me to put him too much higher than here. And really, there's a debate for him being even lower on the list. But I feel like the fact that he controlled those first 2 weeks to begin with, the fact that he technically built the initial power structure, was enough to have him here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have the person that I was referencing not too long ago, but here we have Rob, the highest ranked pre-juror on the board. And again, there's a debate for Rob being a bit lower on the list. However, I feel like the circumstances that led to him being booted this early are very wonky in my view, where he is part of the Guys Alliance early on. He actually was at one point the best positioned person within the Guys Alliance, where he obviously was well positioned with them, but obviously had relationships outside of that, namely with Shenaya. And obviously that's pretty good. People seem to trust him quite a bit. However, he obviously causes Ty to be wary of him. And really, a lot of this feels pretty unwarranted, if you ask me. But the fact that Rob does generate that leads to him being targeted in week 2. Mind you, there was a chance earlier on that they could have held off. But really, Ty just takes the reins here in targeting Rob, which is pretty insane and really fractures that guy's alliance moving forward. Now, I did debate how much to fault Rob for this, and really, I just don't think there is that much you can fault with Rob. I feel like it was more so Ty, like, not playing well than anything else. And even in the round where it goes home, like, Rob goes home in a 7-4 vote. He had 4 people that went so far as to vote to keep him in the game, which is pretty good there. However, again, it's still not great that he was the second boot of the season. However, considering that I don't think he did that much wrong in the game and he seemed pretty well positioned during week 1, I did decide to make him the highest ranked of these pre-jurors, which is why he is here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and from this point on, everyone left on the list has made the jury phase, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 9, I felt like this was pretty clear to me. We have Hope. And Hope was a bit of a disappointment on the season, where I was pretty high on him coming into it. However, he came into the game and it was pretty much not really the player that I was expecting him to be, where he is included in the guys and lines early on. However, even then, he's pretty clearly like the on the bottom of that group and the one that's taken the least seriously. Like we even see like Hope like giving out like ideas and like the guys just sort of dismissing him for a lot of it. And you can tell that he was struggling a bit as well. Like there were points early on where he feeling like this was too much for him. Like he got emotional at points, causing people to want to reassure him. And obviously that kind of leads into him like bringing in a letter from home, which isn't great. Like he does technically break the rules and results in him not playing in that HOH during week 4. And then there's obviously that point as well where he decided his strategy was just to win all the competitions. Like he gets so upset during week 2, like when he doesn't win the veto, and it gets to the point where he actually asks to be put on the block just so that he can win veto competitions. And he does win the one in week 3. However, obviously the fact that he's volunteering himself for the block is not ideal in the slightest. However, he does eventually find himself in a new alliance. He is included in the Crown along with Jonathan, and I feel like that's something that he could have written out in the future. However, the problem there is obviously Ty wins HOH during that week, and essentially ends up being like between Jonathan and Hope. And while Hope ultimately stays over Jonathan, he is targeted again the very next week after Claudia wins that HOH, and obviously he's just pretty much a goner at that point. I think the thing with Hope is he is in the majority for more of the game than most of the people we already talked about, with the exception of Zach. However, even then, like he was clearly on the bottom of that group. He was probably the most expendable person within those alliances. Where in the guys alliance, he was the clear bottom of that group. And even within the crown, like really the core of that was the Shady Bunch, which Hope was clearly left out of. But he seemed pretty content to ride that out with them and probably lose, as I feel like it's hard to see Hope winning a jury vote, which largely stems to him wanting to quit the game earlier on, and with him like thinking that it's all about winning the competitions. Like he does learn as he goes, but it's still a largely mediocre game. I can't really praise it too much. So because of that, he is here number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another player whose game I find largely mediocre, despite the fact that they made it relatively far. But here we have Renee, who obviously gets all the way to the final 5. However, the road there is incredibly rocky. So first up, she is technically on the block week 1. However, even then, that's due to a twist. But even then, like, she doesn't like have people that really want to save her. She does manage to find like some allegiance with obviously Claudia and Shenaya that eventually results in the girly pods. But really, like, there were people that would have been fine letting her go at that point. She's put on the block again during week 2, and at that point, like, she's there against Rob. And yes, while Rob ultimately goes, like, there were people that wanted to keep Rob in the game, and she even gets 4 votes against her during that eviction vote. So obviously, that's not particularly great either. And I feel like at that point, like, she is joined into that resistance with Koozie to take out Zach, which is pretty good there. And really, like, Zach leaving the game puts her in a very strong position where her, Claudia, and Shenaya are essentially in the center of the house at that point. And ideally, they should have been able to ride the middle. And in fact, Renee was actually pushing them to ride the middle by taking out Dan Zabo that next week. However, Claudia is the one that wanted to target Santina instead. She really wanted them to keep the guys around. And I feel like Claudia gets her way there, which isn't good. And really, by that happening, it results in the girly pops losing the good position that they were in. And yes, while you can say that that's a bad move on Claudia's end, I think it also reflects that Renee just isn't that good at getting people to do what she wants in the game. But even beyond that, Renee becomes a house target at some point, like she is on the bottom. And also, people come around to thinking that she and Santina are a duo, even though they don't have the best relationship in the world. Like, I feel like Renee, again, is not very good at controlling her perception. And I think she also gets lucky by the way the comps play out, to where, despite there being this majority alliance that could have controlled things, we see like the girly pops, like winning all these key competitions to allow the crown to be dismantled, where during week 7, Renee does win the HOH that results in Koozie going home, which you think would be a big move, but at that point I thought it was pretty clear that Koozie was the biggest target left on the board. And again, I do question as well, like how much of this is Renee's own doing. And I do also question whether Renee actually wins as she gets to the end, where it's sort of strange because within the game, people saw her as the biggest jury threat. They thought that she was going to win against everyone, when in reality, like the jury was very low on her. Like they didn't find Renee that impressive. So the fact that Renee is such a big target, despite the fact that she isn't like that big of a jury threat, is also kind of mediocre on her end. You then have the double eviction where she is largely safe due to like the final 3 deal that Claudia and Ty made with her. But even then, like she was a clear third in that. And then the very next week, they go against that to where she is like the clear target there, and she is taken out by Claudia and Ty. So really, I feel like there's not too much you can say about Renee's game that's pretty good. I don't think she has the worst ideas in the world. Like she did recognize during the Dan week that the girly pop should be playing the middle. But the problem is that she didn't really have the capital in order to make the other girly pops do what she wanted. And through that, that ended up putting them in a worse position moving forward. I also question her win equity as well. Like I said earlier, I feel like despite her being seen as this big jury threat, that she didn't really have much to actually win the game. And there were just some points where she actively put herself at the bottom. Like you had that fight that she had that put her at the bottom. You had the fact that people like were seeing her and Santina as a duo for no reason. Like I think there's so many instances of mediocre gameplay from Renee that I can't really have her any higher here, despite the fact that she made it all the way to the final 5. So because of that, I do have her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I did debate this one as well. However, I did decide that this person had some passivity to their game, which is why I do have Jonathan here. And the thing about Jonathan is that he was, again, in the majority for a decent amount of his run. However, there were still plenty of points where I feel like he didn't have things go his way. Where early on, he was obviously a part of that Guys Alliance. He was one of the best positioned players in the house alongside Rob, where he was someone that was a pretty calm presence throughout a lot of it. However, even by then, during week 2, he is one of the people that sticks up for Rob and even votes to keep Rob, which does put him in a bit of hot water moving forward. You know, like as he does lose his closest ally, but obviously also like makes himself not as well positioned with the guys. Although considering the guys do end up losing power the following week with Zach going home, it's not the biggest knock in the world. But then after that, he's able to, again, like sort of regroup to a degree. He is able to get himself into this new majority group with like the Shady Bunch. However, similar to Hope, he is like outside the core of that. However, I will say the thing about Jonathan is that I feel like he was a bit more likely to win the game compared to Hope, where I feel like Hope was someone that probably was not going to have much respect within the game, whereas I feel like Jonathan, had he gotten to the end, he would have like been in a pretty prime position to win a jury vote, as he was a pretty like likable person throughout. However, the issue there is the fact that Ty wins HOH, and obviously they end up on the block alongside Hope, and there was a chance even that he could have stayed. Like the house was relatively split during that round, where Santina was a swing vote, and there was even some discussion over keeping Jonathan. However, I feel like Jonathan sort of drops the ball. He just sort of gives up to a degree and just allows himself to be taken out here, which I don't love as well. And really, that's one of my biggest issues with Jonathan, is that I feel like he's a relatively passive player. He really lacks a killer instinct, and I feel like it really cost him at the end. I feel like it sort of cost him like earlier on, like particularly with him like holding on to Rob a bit too long. But obviously, I feel like it also lends to him like giving up at the end as well. Like I feel like he's not the most active player in the world, and I wish he was a bit more active. However, at the end of the day, I feel like he was still like pretty well liked within the house. I feel like he would have been seen as a pretty big shield to have ahead of them moving forward. So I feel like that could have benefited him to a degree. And I feel like he's someone who, again, I feel like he could have won had he gone to the end. But as it stands, like he is still a relatively earlier boot, which is why he is here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who I kind of see a bit similarly to Jonathan, but played a bit more actively. But here we have Shenaya, and Shenaya was in a good spot for a lot of the game as well. She was part of the group early on. She wasn't in the core of the guys' alliance, of course, but she still had good relationships with Rob, obviously. And then while Rob does get broken up in week 2, I feel like that lends itself to the house turning more against the Zach and Ty side. That leads to Shenaya being in a good spot there. We see her fully solidify this group with Claudia and Renee to form the girly pops. And there was a point after Zach left where they could have ran the middle, but obviously they ended up ceding a lot of that control to the Shady Bunch, which I don't fault Shenaya as much for. I feel like that was more so Claudia than anyone else. But through that, they are not in the best spot, but she still has good relationships with a decent amount of players within the crown, namely a Daniel, that is able to keep her safe for a decent amount of that game. She obviously wins the veto during the week where Jonathan goes home. Like, she uses the veto there to save Renee, which in turn causes Jonathan to be the target after that. And then her side wins the next couple of competitions that allows them to dismantle the crown until the girly pops are in a solid position. But then we get into the double eviction where Claudia does win HOH. However, due to this final 3 deal that she had made with Ty and Renee, that kind of causes Shenaya to fall on the outs there. And while she isn't initially put up on the block, she is ultimately put up there after Ty wins the veto, uses it to take down Anika, and she does end up going home in a 2-1 vote. And again, that's not great that she ends up losing Claudia. By the end of it, the fact that she couldn't get Claudia to remain true to the girly pops is a bit of a knock there. However, I still think Shenaya is an all-around solid player. While she didn't have as much active control in the game as certain other players, I still find her game at least somewhat impressive. Now, I think another thing to take into account is whether she wins at the end, where I felt like for a while she probably was one of the more likely people to win the game. However, by the end of her run, I did sort of question it, as I feel like her lack of competition wins outside of her one veto would have been enough for the jury to really see her game for what it was. And while I do think she probably wins against Renee and probably Claudia, particularly if she was able to win out, I feel like Shenaya probably was not in the best spot to actually win against like Daniel or Anika by the end. And in general, I feel like of the girly pop, she was in probably one of the better positions. However, she wasn't able to take as much control within the game, which was a knock against her. So I feel like through all those things, I did have to leave her here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I did debate this one as well. I sort of went back and forth with these next couple of picks, as I feel like they're relatively close. However, at number 5, I did decide to go with Claudia, the runner-up of the season. Now, for the last couple of weeks, I've said to myself that I probably would vote for Claudia at the end over Ty, and we'll talk about Ty more later on, and I still think I stand by that. However, if I'm being honest, that doesn't mean Claudia played a good game. I still feel like her game is largely mediocre, and I feel like there are a number of faults you can point with it. Earlier on, she's in a fine enough position. She is closely aligned with the guys. She has a bit of a showman with Ty, and while Ty doesn't treat her the best, she decides to stay with him. It's sort of weird because she keeps going back and forth where it's Ty would treat her pretty poorly, wouldn't trust her with information, and she would occasionally distance herself from him, but then somehow find herself back with him later on, which I think is a bit of a weird circumstance there, but whatever. We then get her building this group with Renee and Shenaya to form the girly pops, and that becomes a bigger factor after the Zach boot, where essentially Claudia was primed to be in the best position within the house, where her group was essentially right in the middle, and they could have rode the middle by targeting Santina the following week. However, she decides to go for Dan instead. She thinks that it's better to keep the guys around in the house, namely a Ty. And I think through that really gives up a lot of the control that the girly pops had to the Shady Bunch side of things, which I think is a knock there. But through that, they're able to build their relationship with the Shady Bunch. And we see the formation of this side alliance with her, Ty, plus the Shady Bunch that could have been the majority, and I guess later on does become the majority. However, that was not the initial plan. Really, the Shady Bunch was more loyal to the crown compared to Claudia and Ty, in that they were more so a side thing. And really, the main reason those people get to the end together is because a competition wins. Where I feel like, had the competitions played out the way the crown wanted it to, that they probably would have stuck with the crown over Claudia and Ty. But because we saw like Claudia win HOH during the round where Jonathan went home, followed by Renee winning the HOH, then Claudia wins HOH during the double. I think that really like decimated the crown to the point where Claudia and Ty were able to get deeper into the game together. But again, a lot of that is due to competition results. And then we get to the double eviction where she does win HOH and she doesn't even put Ty on the block. And she does say afterwards that a lot of this because at that point there was this final three deal with Ty and Renee. However, Claudia also had a very clear path that she could have gone with Renee and Shenaya, like sticking with the girly bunch. And the fact that she just sticks with Ty and doesn't even put Ty on the block to begin with is a pretty big knock there. Like, even if she planned to go deeper into the game with Ty, she could have at least put him up on the block and then maybe he wins the veto, like takes himself down that way. Or if he doesn't win veto, just take him out at that point, as she doesn't really like benefit much from him staying in the game. But she essentially chooses Ty over like the girly pops, sends them out, sends Shenaya out. Shenaya in particular is very upset at her, but it doesn't matter because she's just riding her way towards the end at that point. She is on the block during the final five, but after Ty wins the veto, uses it on her, she's essentially locked for the end game, where basically at that point, Ty and Claudia are far and away better in competitions than Anika or Daniel. And sure enough, that leads to her winning final HOH, where has to choose between Daniel and Ty. And really, she loses to both of them, but I think her taking Ty to the end only further cements that she loses at the end. And it's not the greatest game in the world. I think part of her problem is her jury perception. Like, I think her jury management is not great. I think she has this problem of coming off as a bit too loyal to Ty. And to be fair, she genuinely was loyal to Ty. She was planning to take Ty to the end by the end of it. But aside from that being a suboptimal move, considering that Ty, like, for a lot of that game, did not treat her that well, and also the fact that she probably loses to Ty as well, just makes her come off as like a bit too loyal and a bit too passive in the game. And I think it really just harmed her chances of winning the game. It made me feel like that Claudia wasn't so much playing to win the game. It just made her feel like she was more content to just get to the end with Ty for whatever reason. And plus, like, her sticking loyal to Ty, like, even at the point of the double eviction, just further soiled her jury perception to where even if she got to the end with Daniel, she probably loses that as well. So I think there's that to consider. And even earlier in the game, like the fact that she had this chance to ride the middle, be in the best position in the house, and she threw that away to again keep Ty around is another break knock to her game. So I think at the end of the day, I think Claudia's game is actually like not that good. And while I would vote for Claudia over Ty, I think the fact that she did all these things that one ruined her position, but also ruined her chances of winning at the end, even if she got to the end without Ty, makes it so that it's hard to put her too much higher than here. So because of that, I do have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who in some ways is similar to Claudia, but I feel like it's just a better version of her. But here we have Anika. And Anika did surprise me as well, where I was obviously very low on her in the preseason, and as I feel like she didn't really know much about the show. However, I do have to give her credit. She did learn more about this game as the season went along, and surprisingly did well, all things considered. Now, she does get out to a bit of a bumpy start. She is put on the block during week 1, although even then, Ty does use the veto on her, so I guess that's a good thing. But even beyond that, she's not initially in the majority group. However, later on, she is able to build like these good relationships, particularly with Daniel, and obviously they pull in Koozie later on, to where they become the shady bunch, and they're able to essentially control the game during a lot of that midsection, where they are sort of this dominant alliance, and they are eventually able to create the crown, which is something that could have been the majority alliance moving forward, but even then they're able to build a side alliance with Claudia and Ty in the event that they lose the numbers, which obviously they end up doing so. And again, like a lot of it from that point on is Daniel and Anika surviving together until they're just down to just Claudia, Ty, and Renee. Now, she does win HOH during week 5, and similar to Claudia, she does not even put Ty up on the block, which I do have to knock her for. She puts up Claudia and Renee, Ty wins the veto anyway, and at that point, like, her closest allies on the block with Renee. Now, granted, Renee goes home regardless. However, it's still not a good position to be in. At the Final Four, she was pretty much just screwed unless, I guess, her or Daniel won the veto, which was not very likely to happen given they were up against Ty and Claudia. And at that point, she's just a goner. So I think it's definitely like a rocky endgame. However, I think in a lot of ways she gets sort of screwed over by the competitions where she was someone that like was in a good position to get towards the end of the game, but because like people like the girly pops and Ty kept winning competitions, it basically forced them to cannibalize their own alliance until by the final four they just had no shot of getting towards the end. So I do think they get a bit unlucky in that regard. And I think another thing you had to give Anika credit for is her jury chances, where in a lot of ways, for a lot of that game, she was seen as sort of the opposite of Renee, whereas Renee was seen as someone that was a big threat within the game, but was not actually a jury threat. I feel like Anika is someone that was seen as a small threat by the players within the game, but the players outside the game in the jury, like they were actually very high on her. Like Koozie was pretty high on her to the point where she was still willing to vote for Anika over most people outside Ty at the point where she went home. So I think that's a pro there. I think a lot of the Crown members were obviously impressed by her as well, to where she was one of the more likely people to get their votes at the end. So I think Anika definitely had a shot of winning the game had she gone to the end. However, with the way the end game broke down, it just made it very hard for her to do so. So I think that's a factor. And at the end of the day, I think another thing that's holding her back is the fact that I feel like of the people in the Shady Bunch, I feel like she probably had the least direct control in how the game is playing out. And so I think that's another factor. But I still think Anika played a relatively impressive game, which is why she is here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this was another very interesting placement, but we do have the winner of the season. We do have Ty. Now, I did say earlier that I would have voted for Claudia over Ty, and I still stand by that. However, I think the fact that Ty does win the game, and I think some pros that you can give to his end game were at least enough to have him above both Claudia and Anika, but he still played like a pretty bad winning game for the most part. Where early on he was in the majority group, he was with like that guys alliance, was in a pretty solid position. And he was obviously suspicious of Rob due to Rob having a slightly better relationship with Shenaya. And, while that's good that he could recognize that, like, and that he could see that Rob would be a threat later on, the fact that he targets Rob in week 2 is really insane. Like, it essentially blows up the alliance that he was in and makes it so that Zach and Ty were on the bottom coming into that next week. And yes, while Zach was always going to be the target over Ty, like it's still not great that he's losing his ally there. And I think something that tends to get forgotten about is that Ty almost quits the game with Zach. Like at the point where Zach is quitting the game in the DR, like Ty is there with him. Zach tries to get Ty to quit the game with him. And yes, while he doesn't go through with it, I mean, he was at least sort of considering it. And for me, the fact that Ty almost quits the game is a very big knock in my view. I think that's not particularly great. But then after that, like we see like him again at the bottom, like Santina puts him up on the block, and then we get Daniel deciding to use the veto on him. Now I know some people say that this is probably a bad move on Daniel's end, but obviously it's still good that Ty was able to get Daniel to want to use the veto on him, as it allows like Ty to be included on this alliance moving forward. Now, yes, like him and Claudia are in like this sort of side alliance with the Shady Bunch, but even then that's not the main alliance. After that, he manages to win HOH, where through that he's able to get both Hope and Jonathan on the block, ensuring that one of those two goes home, taking out a member of the Crown, but also taking out like someone that would have been a bigger threat to him in competitions moving forward, which obviously ties into his endgame. But then after that, we get the Fatal Feast, where he is the last person picked. He was relatively close to going home during that, but with Santina being a clearer target over him, I mean, he does ultimately stay there. But then after that, we get Claudia winning HOH, who does finally manage to get out Hope, especially after he wins the veto there. And then from that point on, Ty and Claudia are far and away like the biggest comp competitors left in the game. And we see that where Ty literally wins 4 vetoes in a row during this stretch. And along the way, they're able to take out the members of the Crown one by one. Then we get to the double eviction, where I do give him some credit for that. Like Claudia wins HOH, doesn't even put Ty up in the block despite him being this big threat. And now, yes, he does win the veto anyway, but the fact that Claudia doesn't even put him up on the block is pretty insane there. They're able to build this final three deal with Renee that keeps him safe during that round. But then after that, Anika wins HOH, and similar to Claudia, doesn't even put Ty up in the block. However, this one I don't give Ty as much credit for, as Anika didn't really have much reason to keep Ty around. And really, I feel like a lot of the reason Anika doesn't put Ty up is because she just figures that Ty's gonna win the veto anyway. So like, why even bother? So like, I feel like that's more so Ty like winning competitions than him actually convincing Anika to keep him around. Now he does win veto anyway, but even there, he has some pretty bad jury management with both Renee and Anika. And I feel like that's another knock against this game, is that despite him being in a spot to where he should have been one of the clear jury favorites, particularly by the time Koozie went out, like the fact that he's still like treating these people poorly could have come back to bite him by the end, but whatever, it doesn't. Final four, like he wins HOH and is able to get through there. And then in final three, like him and Claudia get to part three together in a position where they both take each other and Ty wins against her easily. So it's a bit of a rocky game where I feel like there were multiple points where Ty blew up his own game. Like the fact that he targeted Rob as early as he did is pretty bad. I feel like a lot of his success in the game comes from competition wins, where either he's winning these competitions himself or people like Claudia are winning these competitions. And yes, while Claudia does want to take him to the end, I feel like Ty himself doesn't really do much to really earn that. If anything, like he treats Claudia poorly during a lot of the season. And I feel like the fact that Claudia keeps coming back towards him, like, isn't really so much anything he's doing, just more so Claudia acting on her own. Again, he has pretty questionable jury management during a lot of that end game. And I think a lot of his jury perception comes from him winning these competitions at key points. He's also one of these players that tries to claim that he played an honorable game when in reality, like, he's very unlikable. Like, he's one of these people that, like, the moment he gets any sort of power, like, he acts very cocky. So, like, I feel like he's one of these people that, like, gets pretty fortunate there. And I feel like the thing with Ty is, like, I feel like there's a lot of things, like, that happen to him in the game. Good things that just don't feel earned at all. Like, I feel like things just happen to Ty, and through him being, by and away, the biggest physical competitor by the time of the end game, just allows him to steamroll. And the fact that the jury just rewards him for winning these competitions and just coming off as his biggest threat isn't so much things that he's doing, just the way things are playing out. And I feel like he didn't really do much to earn a lot of those things. So I feel like at the end of the day, Ty is actually a pretty mediocre winner of the show, and I made it pretty clear all of his holes. But there were still enough like pros to his game, like the fact that, again, even though he didn't do much to garner it, Claudia was still loyal to him, and also the fact that like people like just like grew to like see him as this big jury threat by the end of it was enough to have him above Claudia. And also the fact that he does actually win the game makes it so that he is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I still have issues with this person's game, plus they are a relatively earlier boot, but I still feel like they have more potential to win the game had they gone to the end. But here we have Koozie. Now, again, I still have issues with Koozie's game, but we'll get to that more in a moment. However, I still feel like Koozie had a lot of agency throughout the game. Like, early on, like, she's not in the initial core majority group. However, she does a good job at, like, keeping her threat level low while building these relationships that eventually culminates in her winning HOH during week 3. But even then, I do question some of her decision making here, where she does initially put up Santina and Vanessa, where she does want Vanessa there as the pawn. However, even then, like, I don't think she realized that Vanessa, like, would have been, like, someone that could have been targeted by the Zack and Ties of the world had the nom stayed the same, and I feel like it was a very risky play. And obviously, when Vanessa leaves the game, like, that's not ideal either. She does then shift her target towards Zack by the end of the week, and I do think targeting Zack, like, and rallying the women to do that is not ideal either, as by taking out Zack, you are basically taking away a unifying force for the woman. And I feel like the girly pods probably would have like gravitated back towards Ty and some of the other guys had she gone through with that. Now, it doesn't end up working out that way. It actually ends up benefiting her, but I still feel like it was a questionable move here with her taking out Zack here. But then after that, like she's able to get through the next 2 rounds all right. She is able to again build the crown like with her and the Shady Bunch, which is a tight trio, but then like build like these side alliances with the Claudia and Ty, but then also with Jonathan and Hope. And I do think she gets a bit lucky as well that Claudia wants to keep Ty around, as I feel like that hands a lot of power away from the girly pods, which was the situation that resulted from her wanting to target Zach. But then through that, they're able to get through that round. But then after that, I do think they get a bit unlucky with circumstances where Ty wins HOH, puts up Hope and Jonathan, which then forces the crown to turn on each other. And they do decide to vote out Jonathan in that spot. And then after that, Koozie wins HOH in a spot where she wants to target Santina, which I don't think is the best move either. But then Santina goes after the Fatal Feast anyway. But then Claudia wins the HOH and puts up Hope and Koozie. She's on the block for the first time this season. And while it's somewhat impressive that she's able to survive the vote there, like it's still not great that Ty wants to target her through that. And then the following week, Renee wins HOH, again, one of her worst case scenarios. And this time she is eventually taken out for being the biggest threat. So I think Koozie is someone that definitely had a decent amount of control during the game, and she was definitely like the most likely winner of the season had she gone to the end. However, I feel like she made a number of questionable decisions along the way, like her targeting Zach during week 3 definitely could have handed a lot of power to the girly pops, and had Claudia not screwed it up the following week, it's very possible that she would have been on the outs moving forward. You have her wanting to target Santina during her second HOH week. Santina is someone that wanted to take her towards the end of the game. Like, so that's not great there. And really, that's a lot of her game. Like, she does gradually lose people that want to take her deeper into the game. Like, Jonathan also wanted to take her towards the end of the game. Even Dan Zabo wanted to take her relatively deep into the game. Like, she does lose people that want to take her to the end, all while keeping around Daniel and Anika, who were planning to cut her at certain points. So I think she gets a bit unlucky there. And really, by the time she gets like put up and targeted, she is essentially the biggest target left on the board. I don't really feel like there's much she could have done to truly save herself there. So I do feel like Koozie like isn't the greatest player in that regard, but she's still a very good social player. She was able to build decent relationships throughout the game, and she was able to build a decent amount of agency in the game. But like you can still question the decisions there, and really compared to the other people we already talked about, I think she has more pros than those other people. And yes, while she still has her problems, I still feel like the fact that she was definitely one of the more likely jury winners is a big reason she is here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe played the best game on Big Brother Canada 11 is Daniel C. And for me, this wasn't even close. I think Daniel clearly played the best game on the season, where I feel like throughout a lot of the game, he was very good at positioning himself and managing his threat level. He built a lot of very solid relationships, where early on, again, he wasn't in the core group, but he still had good relationships with a lot of those guys in that guy's alliance, to where he was unlikely to be targeted in the future. He's able to remain in a good position during a lot of those early weeks until he's able to formally solidify a trio with Anika and Koozie to form the Shady Bunch. But even then, he recognized that Koozie was one of the biggest threats and that he would need to cut her along the way. So there's that. And really, after Zach goes home, like they're able to formally solidify control by building like these alliances. He builds the crown. He also builds like a side alliance with Claudia and Ty, and he has relatively good connections with Shenaya and some of the girly pops there as well, to where people think that they're his number 1 for a lot of it. Now, during the Dan week, he does get a bit of flack for using the veto on Ty, which obviously is bad in hindsight, considering that Ty ends up beating him at the end. However, I don't think this was that bad of a move for him, as it allows him to build a good relationship with Ty, to where even when Ty starts winning all these competitions and chipping away at the crown, he still wants to keep Daniel around, and he does want to take Daniel towards the end of the game. And that's a big thing that allows him to remain safe as the crown is being picked off one by one. Now, I do think a big issue with Daniel's the fact that he can't really win competitions, especially once Hope and Jonathan leave, to where he is, again, like losing his allies one after the other. But again, like along the way, like he is like seeing like these bigger targets go over him. Like Hope goes home over him, like Koozie ends up going home, and he really isn't put up on the block until the double eviction, where at that point he is put up against Anika. But even then, like Ty and Renee, like they're more willing to keep Daniel around. And yes, while they do use the veto on Anika, Daniel clearly had the votes to stay anyway, so that's not too big of a knock there. In the final 5, like, Anika does win the HOH, and it's not great that she doesn't put Ty up on the block, as it opens the door up for Ty to win the veto, use it on Claudia, and basically force her to put Daniel on the block. But then again, like, the numbers were there anyway, although even then it was a tie. But then we get to the final 4, and really from that point on, like, Ty wanted to take Daniel to 3 over Anika. So he's able to do that. And then at final 3, he's locked out of final HOH, where he's essentially screwed at that point. So I do find it very impressive how well positioned Daniel was. And I think there's a lot of comparisons to be made with Tommy from BB21, someone who was in a great position, but because of unlucky comp results, he did lose his allies along the way, but was still one of the last few people remaining from his group. And he was ultimately the final person to be cut by the end of it. Now, I think another thing to consider is his jury chances, where obviously his jury management with Koozie is not great, to the point where Koozie is pretty upset with him and doesn't want to vote for him by the end of it. And there's definitely a debate over whether Daniel could even win at that point, where really before Koozie went, he was seen as one of the biggest jury threats outside of Koozie. But then with Koozie being against him, there was this huge doubt over how much Koozie could really shift the jury against Daniel. And I do think it gets a bit overblown. I don't think Koozie would have absolutely decided it in every scenario. Where, from what I understand, like, Daniel probably wins against Claudia at the end, which probably he would have done had he won that final HOH. But still, like, it's still not great jury management on his end that he was able to turn Koozie against him over Anika. So that's not great. And again, the fact that he can't really win those endgame comps, to where he only wins that one veto in that season, where outside of that, like, he just loses his allies due to these unlucky comp results. But still, compared to the rest of the field, he played by far the best game. He had says probably the least holes out of anyone in the game. And I feel like he was someone that I was wanting to win by the end, given that he did play the best game. So it's for all those reasons that I do have him here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video, along with my coverage of Big Brother Canada 11. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now, I am still covering Survivor 44 as that is happening, so stay tuned for that. After that season ends, I plan to do some postseason coverage for Survivor, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.